All right, hello, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I just wanted to mention that this is part of a monthly webinar series, so make sure that you are checking with us every month to see what new topic we are hosting a webinar about. I just wanted to remind everybody that your lines are currently on mute. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please go ahead and put them into the questions box on the right-hand side. Also, the slides and recording of this webinar will be available after the presentation. We will be providing you a link at the end. All right, jumping into the agenda here. If you've downloaded our ebook on maximizing your return on rounding, you probably already recognize these 10 steps. We're going to use this as the foundation of our presentation today and provide a little bit more insight on them. If you haven't downloaded our ebook, I recommend that you do that. It's provided on the right-hand side as a handout. It's a great resource to keep this information with you and gives a little bit more details. And jumping in, let's talk about who we are. So my name is Katie Anthony. I'm the marketing coordinator at My Rounding, as well as the moderator for today's event. I also have Michael Niederhauser and Steve Bachtel with me today. Gentlemen, would you like to introduce yourselves?
Sure. Hey, Katie. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Michael Niederhauser. I'm the Vice President of Customer Experience here at My Rounding, and I've been here with the organization for the last 2 years. Before that, I spent some time doing some rural health education, awareness, and screenings here in Colorado, and I've also spent some time doing some consulting work in Washington, D.C., and I'm quite proud of my service in the U.S. Peace Corps.
Thanks, Michael. And my name is Steve Bachtel. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer here at My Rounding. I have about 20 years experience in healthcare, consulting with and working with hospital systems across the country. Did my MHA work here at the University of Denver on topics specifically around population health and the patient experience. So very excited to talk about this topic today.
Great, thank you both. We're going to jump right in, and now that you all know who we are, we want to find out who you are. So there should be a poll up on your screen right now.
Yeah, and this is, Katie is really going to help us understand who the audience is today. So if you could please complete this, it's going to help Michael and I understand kind of how we should probably tailor this presentation. Whether you are perhaps an administrator for a hospital that's trying to kick something like this off, or maybe you're a member of the frontline staff that's interested in the topic, we would love to know.
Great, so it looks like everybody has had a chance to weigh in. And we have about 25% executive leaders, about 63% department managers, and about 13% project leaders.
So I heard, I'm sorry, 63% department managers?
Yep.
All right. Is the majority of our group. And that sounds probably what we expected. So thanks for that feedback. So jumping right in, we've got our first slide is on connect to purpose, and honestly, Katie and Michael, this is probably my favorite part of the whole presentation, because at the end of the day, connecting to purpose is pretty important to all of us. I also think of this as our why, maybe our why statement, and why are we in doing this. When we had a conversation about what is the #1 predictor of success for an initiative, as we looked at all of our different customers that work with us on rounding, we all landed on, they all started, or at least the really successful ones, started with connecting to purpose. So Michael, maybe you can tell us a little bit about why this might be so important.
Sure, Steve. Well, you know, it all comes back to really a simple question. It's why are we even bothering with this whole rounding stuff? You know, we know that there are some empirical data points that tell us why rounding is right. There needs to be something more than that. And so I was recently down with a mid-sized facility in Georgia, and they had a problem with their rounding activity ebbing and flowing, going with the tides. It was here and then it was gone. I had an opportunity to speak with them and go through an exercise really connecting about why are we bothering rounding? What's in it for us? Why are we doing this? They found that they were simply checking boxes as they were going through the rounding process. And sure, they were talking, but it's one thing to talk and it's another thing to engage. And so they landed on a point that worked for them. And what that did was give a little bit of context to each one of their rounders, to everyone that was involved with the project, to understand that this is bigger than checking boxes. We're asking these questions to try and engage and get something out so that in their case, they would be able to deliver the most incredible care possible for their patients. And that's kind of the why that they came to with this particular perspective. So, so many times we see the why as that driver. We also see a need to come back to that why throughout the process. And I think when you have the why to begin with, it's a guiding principle, and it's something we can always fall back on to make sure we're in line with what we're originally set out to do.
And it's kind of neat for me. I got the chance to do some coaching a little earlier this week, and it's almost a litmus test. And it's if you're currently a department manager and you're about to walk into a room with one of your staff members and talk to a patient, before you walk in the room, ask them, "Why are we doing this?" I think it's going to be really telling what they tell you. Yeah. And if they're flat-footed and they don't know why, we've got some work to do. We need to kind of help them with that. So ask your team, why are we about to go do this? You'll quickly find out whether or not they've got it or not.
Great point, Steve.
All right.
Great. So we have one more poll question here. Since we just talked about why we think you should be rounding, we want to know why you think you are rounding currently. We have about 6 different answers on there, and we'll give you a few seconds to go ahead and jump on there and give us your answers.
So these are the ones that I think we typically hear.
Absolutely.
And I hate to say it, and I'm going to be really curious to see what these results look like. But that last one, we've been told to, a lot of times is the #1 response for why.
Yep.
And that just means that we get to do some improvement there.
All right, great. We still are seeing a few more results coming in, so we're going to give you a few more seconds. All right. So we actually have a pretty good spread of results here.
Yeah, I really like this. So 50% provide so the #1 is retain, engage, and grow employees. 58% want to retain, engage, and grow employees. So how fascinating, because I think a lot of our examples come from patient rounding, but in this case, we've got a group of people on the call today who are really interested in retention and engaging employees. So let's definitely talk about that today. #2 is provide the best possible care for our patients. And I think that's almost always an overriding goal for the organizations that we work with. Create an always culture came in at 33%. It sounds like maybe we guessed a good one there. To set yourself apart in the crowded healthcare marketplace, 25%. Also a pretty robust response. 0% for we've been told. So obviously a lot of leaders on here, but I think that's great. I'm glad that we don't have anybody on there that's just doing it because they've been told to do it. And it's probably why you're on a webinar in the first place.
I would think so. Some self-qualifying there.
Right. Okay. When we talk about maximizing your return on rounding, really the second step is to get some top-down support. And I really see this breaking down. When I go out and visit with our customers, I see kind of 2 camps. One camp is they've been blessed with a leader who does top-down, mandates it all, and here's the roadmap. And puts everybody at ease, and everybody can just go out and kind of exercise off the roadmap. And then there's the second camp, and it's a bigger camp. They've got more tents. And in that case, we're leading from the middle. There's perhaps leadership has lots of competing initiatives, comes in and mandates this one day, but maybe a couple months later, other things come up, and you have to figure out how to lead from the middle. And Michael, we've been talking about this, and I think you've got some examples of how you can do that.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that always rings true with me, Steve, here is I hear time and time again, how are we going to make this so it's not just another flavor of the moment? Yeah. We have so many projects, so many initiatives, and things tend to come and go. And that's really what we're trying to avoid with this very process here. And so, if I think about rounding on direct reports, really engaging and retaining staff, what it takes is, indeed, it takes someone at the middle to be able to do that. But is that going to sustain over a long term? Well, no. In fact, at one of our systems down in the South, they had this very same environment where they're trying to, on a specific set of units, increase their engagement amongst their staff. And they were able to see some really great gains. But they noticed over time, this initiative would wax and wane. It would come and go. And they set aside some time to think about what they needed to do to get some leadership buy-in. And so what they decided to do was use the data that they had collected about their employee engagement and the process that they had put in place with their rounding practices and shared that data with senior leadership. They went one step further than simply sharing the leadership. They asked for action. And what that looked like was then setting up the leader with the same rounding templates, the same requirements for accountability, and seeing the benefits and getting the action actually creates this incredible upward spiral where we now have a lead by example environment. And that whole process then flows back down throughout everyone, not just where it came from this one silo, but across the entity itself. And so, you know, starting in the middle, it's difficult. It is possible to sustain there, but it's very, very difficult. And that's where if we can get the buy-in, the leadership, top-down support, you can see it not just reinforce where it came from, but spread as well.
Sure. So you've got a middle manager who so believes, or maybe a group of middle managers that so believe in this process and what's going to happen that they went out and they proved it.
Of course.
And when they proved it, then they had something to take back to leadership and say, look, we know that it works, but we need you to basically mandate it so we can kind of keep this alive over time.
That's it, Steve. And I think that the key word you just said is mandate. You know, people react very differently to this is mandatory versus optional.
Yeah.
And even when things are mandatory, hand washing is an example, it's not always 100%.
Right.
And so we need to realize that.
And man, I just heard an example of that where it was around the communication board. And we heard an example from a nurse who said at their organization, if the communication board was not up to date when they went in to do an audit, on the first strike, you get a verbal. On the second strike for not updating it, you get written up. And on the third strike, you're out.
Wow.
Which was really interesting. And what I thought was even more interesting is that the staff on the unit was saying, don't get fired over something so silly like this. So they're encouraging their colleague to say, this is really dumb. We will help you do this, primarily because they didn't want to be short-staffed. They didn't want to be short-handed on the unit. Yeah. But the fact that it was mandated and it had teeth, and honestly, the having teeth part can sometimes really be tough to pull off, but man, does it work.
It can, Steve. And, to bring it back to the leadership component here, I think the biggest thing, it's different to hold people accountable than to also hold yourself accountable. And that really is the final piece, I think, to see the senior leadership team out there rounding on their direct reports. That's where it becomes something true and real, right, as opposed to I'm just being held accountable, and that crosses that gap there.
Makes sense. So now we've identified our why. We've got an executive sponsor on board. We've got our top-down support. The next thing that we have to do is set a target date. So Michael, you tell us that if we don't have that goal in mind, it's likely that this is probably going to fizzle.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's a lot of reasons to choose a start date and some strategy around a good start date. There's a lot that goes on in the annual cycle of the hospital, and we want to be aware of that. Any other projects that are going on, we certainly just want to be aware of those components. But really what I'm talking about here, Steve, is really holding people accountable to that start date. So we all know when this starts and what's accountable to me. So we had a facility on the East Coast that was actually interested in using my rounding and piloting the technology with a couple of their staff first to get feedback. So they had a start date for this, this kind of dry run, if you will. And what ended up happening was a handful of people were doing it, other people were not. They didn't have a complete data set.
Yeah.
There was just general confusion.
And you could see that you could see that in the results, right? You had a bar graph and you saw a big lift maybe at the beginning, and then all of a sudden it started to peter out.
That's exactly what we saw, Steve. And when it came back down, there was a discussion with the senior leadership, the executive sponsor, and our project leader about what's happening here. What do we need to do? What we decided to do was, after kind of quickly reconnecting back to our purpose, is set a hard date for everyone to start using the application.
Right.
And guess what happened? We had a lot better response. Instead of that drive up and the drop down, we saw a great continuous climb up and then the gradual plateau.
But it sounds like you had to probably do some extra work. So you had the first kickoff, and then you had a second kickoff. So there was kind of extra work involved that maybe could have been headed off had you started with the start date.
Yeah, no, I mean, there was a little bit of internal service recovery to the team that didn't have, didn't quite understand what they had to do. So just in the second go live, it probably took more work in that second go live than it would have had we just start with a clear start date right out of the gates.
Makes sense. That's great. So we have our why. We've got an executive sponsor. We set a goal with our start date now. So Michael, at this point, we've got to create some rounds, and my approach would be, all right, I'm going to dictate these 3 questions. We're going to go out, and everybody's going to do these 3 questions. However, you say that maybe dictating is not the best approach.
Steve, I get the desire to do that. I mean, there's no question that there is a time and a place for that, and I think certain elements of that really do have value. What I would encourage you to do, Steve, is to not approach this from a dictate, this shall be, but come with some themes and some trends and some guidelines around what it is that we're trying to accomplish based on our overall why, based on the leadership buy-in, and then bring the group together. So let's talk about who actually is going to be conducting the rounds. I want to have some stakeholders from that group as a part of the discussion to actually craft the questions themselves. So,
hey, I'm going to stop you right there because this sounds like creation through committee, and I don't want to get 20 questions that I have to go out and round in, all because I want to be collaborative.
Steve, I hear you, definitely. And really what we're talking about is creating priorities amongst the group and coming to an understanding on what our top 5 questions are going to be. 5 is what we generally recommend. In fact, that may even be too many. 3 might be the sweet spot in order to have an engaging conversation. What's important here is that people get their word out, and we understand that we have a set of priorities on what we want to handle. The great thing is we're coming up with a set of questions now, and these are our top 5 priorities now. If we're doing our jobs right, if we're rounding effectively, then these top 2 items are not going to be problems in 3 months from now. And guess what happens? Our list of items that we prioritize gets shifted up, and we eventually get to use those as well. So I think creating kind of guidelines around what we're aiming for in terms of themes, in terms of the why, and then providing a space, though, for those end users to discuss and come to a decision about it is really what gets buy-in. And I think that any number of personal examples where someone comes up to me and says, Michael, you have to do this. My immediate reaction is, well, hold on. What are you telling me now? I have to do this? It's so different than if someone comes up to me and says, Michael, I have an idea. Will you help me do this? Well, sure, yeah. I'd love to. And that's the basic philosophy here, Steve.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. I think you've sold me on it. I think the other thing that I've seen from a best practice standpoint is don't measure or don't ask questions that you don't intend to follow up on the data.
Yeah.
So a lot of times there's a lot of ideas about, I want to ask this question about my unit, that question about my unit. And what I would say is if someone is so adamant about asking a particular question, then you have to hold them accountable for for exercising on the output, for following up on what we find out from that data. Because I've seen organizations that might ask 9 or 15 questions, but they're only using the data for 1, or maybe they're just measuring, is it happening?
Yeah.
Why am I asking 15 questions if I'm not going to act on 15 different data points?
That's it, and really it can be solved with one simple question. What are you going to do with it? And if the person comes back and says, well, it'd be interesting to know. That might be true, but interesting to know is not actionable.
All right. I think that makes sense. So we've talked a lot about, I think, just the process of rounding. And so far, I think we've got some really good ideas about how do I create a rounding initiative. This next topic, though, is talking about issue types. And I think issue types is something that's interesting that's not always part of rounding. My guess is that for most rounding that's perhaps not happening with a tool, it might be something like risk management issues that fall into that category. But when you start using a technology, you start getting the ability to gather additional issue types, things like environment of care or even, say, nutrition. And now you can start to track that. So, Michael, you tell us that it's kind of important to start really thinking about what types of issues are we going to bump into while we're rounding and what do we want to track?
Yeah, I would take a step back from that, Steve, and really caution you against saying if you're using a tool, you'll likely need these issue types. I would say if we are actually in the process of asking engaging questions to our staff, if we're not getting issues that are popping up, then we're probably not asking the right questions in the right way.
Right.
So, regardless of the application you use or don't use, identifying the top trending themes of issues that are coming out really are going to be what adds value to your overall process, because if we can start to put these things into groups, we can identify how frequently things are coming up, what the average time is to get them resolved, and ultimately what we want to do is change these from issues into opportunities.
And I really like that, Michael. And I know that one of the examples we were about to use was around patient rounding. But since we've got so many folks on the line right now who are interested in engaging staff, one of the questions that our sister organization, the Studer Group, uses is, do you have the tools and equipment needed to do your job? This is one of my favorites. I certainly use this one with my team. And we recently did this with a large organization. We were working across 6 locations, and across those 6 locations, when we asked that question, we started getting in the results. We started getting the letters AEL, and I had no idea what AEL was. But as we got them, it became a bigger and bigger issue. So I got on the line with them and I said, "What is AEL?" And they said, "Well, that's our payroll system. We just implemented it." And people have been having trouble logging in. Mm-hmm. So they had lots of kind of individual stories about AEL, but they didn't know that it was an issue across all 6 locations. And it turns out it was, and it easily fixed. Yeah. So here's a good example of it was great for staff engagement because we fixed a problem that was causing them to be disengaged. And we were able to actually create an issue type around it that became a bucket for, are you having any trouble with HR systems?
Yeah, yeah, good example.
All right, so we've got the issues and we've created our buckets for issues, but I'd like to, now that we have all these issues created, we're going to have to define a process about how to resolve them. My other thought is that if we don't resolve them, what's going to happen? People are going to probably stop putting issues in the system.
Yeah, it's interesting when you talk about this process, a lot of the times the first reaction is, well, geez, we have all these issues coming up. We're going to have to resolve them. The issues are there regardless. And so starting to actually define out what the process will look like for each one of these categories is really, we're taking a big project and breaking it down into smaller components. And so usually this has a couple of different phases, and we like to help our customers out first by saying, what existing processes do you have to manage issues? And that's usually pretty quick feedback. We have our plant ops, engineering, they have well-defined processes. IT, they have well-defined processes. It might go out a little bit, risk management specific, patient risk components, and then it drops off.
Yeah, a lot of these are I go down the hall and I tell somebody.
That's it. Or, maybe I have a cheat sheet of phone numbers I can call some folks, and that's the process. Well, with the use of technology, of some application, or at least some process, you can identify, what the categories are, like we talked about a minute ago, and then actually define and set expectations for who is going to resolve an issue, in what amount of time is acceptable, and what we're going to do with that information. And ultimately, we're collecting the information and doing something with it. And so in your example a moment ago, Steve, about the AEL system, this is a situation where if I'm recording this on paper, or even maybe I've got this information down in my log and someone else does over here, we have all these isolated incidences. And if it's 1 out of, 25 of my staff, that's not that significant. But when we aggregate all of that information, we see that this is actually a pretty big deal.
Right.
We can start to be proactive with it. So it's kind of that unified voice coming together there. One really great example of this, Steve, is a facility in the Midwest. They noted that their nutrition services team was having some problems with service recovery components. And so they went to great lengths to work with the team, again, a collaborative component, because everyone has to be bought in. If I'm going to be assigned issues, I need to have a part in that process and own it. They worked with the team to define a really clear set of expectations around, if we have a problem, this is what we're going to do, and they logged it in the application. If it was a high priority item, they would even give a phone call. In this particular case, a nurse leader was rounding on a patient, collecting some good feedback, conducting a round, found out that there was a problem with one of the lunch orders.
Yeah.
And the nurse leader took it down. Let me just make sure I got this right. So you're saying this was the problem. Entered it into the application and sent it in the middle of the round to the food and nutrition team. By the time, and she continued on with the round. By the time she was done, the food and nutrition service team member was actually up there correcting that problem.
Wow, that's great.
I mean, I can think about, first of all, what it meant to the nurse leader.
Yeah. That
here we are, part of this team. What it meant to the food and nutrition team member to really be able to fix something in the moment and learn. And, to put myself in the situation of the patient, I'm seeing incredible communication. I'm seeing teamwork. I'm seeing a well-operating, real machine and a positive experience. So, I hate to, use the cliche, but they certainly turned a frown upside down.
Right, right. Well, and plus that got measured, and if it gets measured again tomorrow and the next day, we'll be able to see are we reducing the number of occurrences of this, or are they increasing, and do we have a bigger underlying problem? Really makes a lot of sense. So far we've talked about a lot of the pre-planning that goes into these initiatives, everything from getting that buy-in to really how do we create the process. So I think we've created a really nice process. Congratulations, Michael. You've done a great job. Up until this point, now of course it's time that we roll it out to our staff.
Yeah.
And that's the training component. So I think as we've talked about training, Michael, and you talk about rolling it out to the teams, one of the first things you talk about, just like we did, is tying it back to that why, or tying it back to purpose. Tell us about that.
Sure. Well, I mean, I look at training really, it's many different components, but to kind of simplify things for me, there's the actual process of rounding itself. And the first step in the process of engaging with a staff member or engaging with a patient is really remembering why the heck I'm taking the time to do this. And I'm taking a lot of time out of my schedule every month to meet with every single one of my direct reports because they have valuable feedback from me and they're a valuable team member, and I want to engage and retain them. That changes this from, gosh, I've got 40 things to do, to, wow, this is here, this is in the moment. This is why I'm connecting with my team member. And so that is the very first thing, and I think if you have that, working on some of the finer points of having a discussion, of active listening, of recording information, closing the loop, they come much more naturally. So that's kind of the one piece, Steve, is the process component. The next piece is the technology piece.
Yeah.
And certainly it's important to have a structured approach anytime you're introducing new technology. Hopefully the technology is intuitive enough that it's easy to pick up and learn, and that's not a barrier. But you put these two things together, the process and the technology, and one thing that I found to work extremely well is creating a space for people to practice. You know, when email first came out, I remember one of my colleagues said, this is never going to catch on.
What do you mean when email first came out? How old are you?
The 1900s, Steve. The year was 1900. No, but seriously, you know, it's a change, right? And my point here is that change is difficult. Whether it's difficult or not, change is going to happen. And it's a matter of how we approach it. So one thing that I like to do is approach training with a concept called real play.
Wait a minute, you said real play, not role play?
It's similar to role play, Steve. Role play is typically a one-on-one experience. Real play adds a third person as an observer. So if I am a manager and you're my direct report, we would actually set up a round. I would have my iPad and I would be rounding on you. We would have a third person like Katie here to observe it. So we would, after we go through the actual round itself, we'd stop. I'd give you how it felt for me, what worked, what didn't. Same thing for you as the person I rounded on. But then Katie would be able to provide that outside set of eyes to provide feedback to both of us. So really, it's just like any skill, practice, practice, practice.
Right. Right. Well, and then there's a couple other concepts here that I like. One of them was kind of what's in it for me, and there's a couple different tacks to this. I really see this as the voice of the front line. So if I'm measuring this with a tool, everything that I gather, whether I'm rounding with an employee, I can start to track and trend this over time, and I can get metrics. So if I say that there's a problem with that payroll system, like like you said, if that happens just one time, it's kind of hard for me to make a statement with administration that we have to fix this. But if I can track it over multiple times across multiple areas, I've got a pretty nice data set. So it really helps amplify my voice as a manager, saying this is a problem that we need to fix. Then I also started thinking about training people on my team. And so when I think about it, and this is really probably more with rounding with patients, but I've seen it done really well. So we've got those people on the team that are really organic when it comes to rounding. A few things need to happen there. Take your really good rounders and pair them up with kind of your middle of the road rounders, because a lot of that will spill over. Your middle of the road rounders will absolutely come along. And then there's that group that maybe isn't great at the interpersonal. They're great technicians, but they don't have that natural style when it comes in around conversation. And that's when I see a tool like this one being even that much more beneficial, because you give them a script and you give them something to follow, which is really, as a technician, something that they typically really like to have. So that's beneficial. Lastly, then, we tend to get questions about, I don't want to introduce technology at the bedside or as part of my conversation with my staff member. Mm-hmm. And that makes an awful lot of sense. However, there are some really great ways to make that organic, and one of them is to share the technology with the person that you're rounding on. Turn it around, show it to them, show them that you're gathering their feedback as they're talking, you're typing. The reason you're typing is because you're trying to capture everything they're telling you to make sure that you're using it as that improvement opportunity. Mm-hmm. When I've seen people do that, I've seen it become just another very organic part of the process.
Yeah, I mean, Steve, I'm sure you've had a conversation with someone before, and if the person is not comfortable, if they're a little awkward, what does it do to you? It makes you feel awkward.
Yeah.
And so we want to make sure that the environment is really is a good one and a positive experience for both parties.
Yeah, well, and I was just thinking about, maybe you're at a party and you meet somebody who's really, really interesting, and they say, hey, I would love to get your phone number. And you're like, great, and you both pull out your phones, and you're typing now on your phone, and you're putting their phone number in, but they're just as engaged. They're looking over your shoulder because they know that, this is how you guys are going to get to connect again tomorrow and talk more about what you were talking about. So you're both engaged, even though you've now introduced technology to interaction.
That's a good point, Steve.
All right, another, and this is probably my second favorite part of the whole presentation, and that is our reinforcement and reward. We've talked a lot about the technical aspects of rounding, and this is, for me, really the glue that holds the whole thing together. Yeah. Once you start to reinforce and reward, it creates some kind of neat things. Neuroscience, the fun thing over the last several years is that people have been placing themselves in MRIs. And we've been able to see where the brain lights up. And one of the really cool things that came out of a recent study is that when you get recognition, you get some dopamine and those parts of your brain start to light up. Turns out that when you give the recognition, the same parts of the brain are lighting up as well. It feels just as good to give as it does to receive. And Michael, you've got some examples of that as well.
Absolutely. I mean, so we kicked off. We had our training, and almost out of the gates, we want to recognize and reward people for doing a great job. And these aren't things that require budgets. These are things that just, a heartfelt thank you goes a long way.
Seriously.
Steve, like you said, the physiological component here. I also saw a study that, a thank you to you, but then a touch on the shoulder, then changes that to a whole nother level. Wow. So if I'm a nurse leader and I've done a round on a patient, and I come out of the room and the patient said that Becky did a phenomenal job taking care of me, I'd hopefully be able to go out of my way and just quickly touch Becky. Hey, this patient said you were absolutely fantastic.
Yeah.
I just want to let you know, thank you so much. It has an impact, and it's easy. So these are some smaller components that we can do. Utilizing a tool like MyRounding, you can look at reports, you can celebrate people's accomplishments on many different levels. Sending out a weekly email summarizing your top rounders. Similarly, helping out the people in the middle to understand what their barriers are. So using reports to help you to recognize is a great way to go about this. It's not all about the individual either, Steve. I mean, we've seen great success happen where we have a couple of different units that are actually going toe-to-toe on their compliance, on their patient satisfaction scores, and certainly employee engagement as well. It's a little bit different scale to measure, but it's still the same concept. So we are all in this really together. And the one theme that I think that we have a challenge getting over, the one concept that I see time and time again, generally in healthcare, we're trained to find and fix problems. We don't often enough find and celebrate those successes. And so building this into your overall plan is really, really important. And like you said, Steve, it has some really positive impact on everyone involved.
Yeah, I think it really helps with hardwiring. I think we've got a poll question now, and that is, what are the barriers to rounding in your organization? So obviously you've signed up for this webinar to hopefully advance your learning a little bit. We're curious to find out, what are some of your biggest barriers? And then maybe we can talk about those. So we'll leave it open for just a few more seconds, but already some good results. So I'm looking over Katie's shoulder here at the results, and number one on this list, 71% is time.
Yep.
And trying to find the time to create this. Number two, at 25% is my team is not engaged.
Mm.
And then number 3, and really the last one, is need tools. I need some new tools and some processes to help me with this. So 0% for leadership is not on board. So we've got groups here where leadership is not a problem. And cost and resources, also not a big problem, because that also came in at 0%. Where we're really trying to find some help here is with time and the team not being engaged. I'm at a little bit of a blank here for time. How do we help add some time?
Well, I mean, we can't put more time in the day. That's always the first thing that comes up.
I'd like to work at that company.
Steve, yes, I'd like you to as well. No, but seriously, I mean, from a time perspective, there's a couple of different ways to approach this. I think having a consistent time to be set aside for rounding relative to your schedule is the single most important thing that you can do. And what I see a lot of times is managers and up will often come in, sit down, check email, and then get sucked into the day.
Yeah, right.
If I can carve out time before I get on those emails, because I know rounding is important to me, what I'm going to end up doing is actually being proactive. And the whole process of rounding, this really is my second point, is that we are proactively finding and fixing problems before they come up. And it allows me to say when I'm going to work on these issues proactively, as opposed to getting the call because something came up and now I need to go put out a fire. It's much less efficient for me to switch gears midway through and go solve this problem, then come back to what I was doing than carving out the time at the beginning of the day. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the beginning of the day, Steve. I think the key takeaway is making the time and making it consistent so it's a habit and not something you're just pushing in your schedule. I have heard of some other facilities as well setting aside sacred time, rounding time, and really the ones that are able to hold that have seen some habitual practices come out of that. So unfortunately, I can't put time in the day, but we can schedule around.
Maybe help better manage it. And I want to really make some emphasis to what you just said about the email, because I know I'm guilty of this too. You sit down, you start reading email, and before you know it, a couple hours have been blown through because you're answering that. And it's almost the equivalent of, would you walk into a room where all of your colleagues are and just immediately start having conversations if you knew you had some work to do? Because that's really what email is. It's conversations that are going to sidetrack you. The other thing that I recently have seen as far as a good practice goes is if you are a manager and you've got some folks that you can train on rounding, you can add some time to your day by delegating some of this. So are there people on your team that instead of perhaps you going out and rounding, you could be delegating that rounding, going out and coaching with them? So follow them on their rounds, get them off to a good start, but have them pick up some of the slack when it comes to rounding as well. That way you're simply, you're prepping them to become the managers I'm sure they would like to be, but also you're taking some of that load off of yourself. So the rounds are happening, you're doing the coaching that we ought to be doing anyway, and you've hopefully freed up a little bit of time for yourself.
Yeah, as long as we are taking a very, very strategic approach and making sure that those rounds are happening together until there's a certain level of expertise and comfort. But you're right, Steve. I mean, all too often there isn't a training program. Someone is put into manager just because they were here and no one else was able to fill the role because of skills or tenure. That doesn't mean that they automatically know how to do this. So, when it comes to that second item there about the team, I think that, having a session to re-engage with that purpose with the team would be valuable. And getting that reconnection back. Why are we spending time rounding on our staff? Why are we spending time rounding on our patient? What are we getting out of it?
Well, and I know that, and I bet most of the people on the call right now likely have a daily huddle, or a sort of shift huddle. You have to have that regular rhythm, and you have to review these results on that regular rhythm. I know I even do that with my team here. We regularly review at least once a week last week's results, because if they know that it's being tracked, if they know that they're being held accountable to those numbers, that's what's going to get them engaged. I'm engaged with the things that my boss is interested in, and everything else is kind of third and fourth tier when it comes to my priorities. The next thing that we'd like to talk about is using the data. So we've got this great tool where we've collected all this data. We've got issues in there. We've got rounding responses in there. I'm seeing how many people are rounding when and where. we got to be able to use that data. And like I said, I'm going to steal this one because I've got kind of a fun example of it. I was working with a hospital in Ohio, and they were collecting an open-ended question. They were asking their patients about what's something that we could do better to improve your care. And it was just open-ended, so it could really range all over the place. What I typically see is, tell us about your pain, right? So we'll get a score about a pain. Tell us about how our nurses communicated with you. Did we come quickly when you rang the call bell? How did your doctor, did your doctors communicate properly? Sure. Very prescriptive questions, kind of got the blinders on a little bit, and they fit inside the box that we all seem to live in. By asking that open-ended question about how could we better serve you, how could we better take care of you, all of a sudden in the results I started seeing the word BIRD, B-I-R-D. Bird. I had no idea why there would be bird in there, but as it turns out, after we kind of parsed through the language, there was a robin's nest in the entrance to the hospital, and many patients were commenting on the fact that they had been dive bombed by the papa bird because it was spring and he was protecting his nest. So something very easy, and after 3 days of getting these responses, we were able to send somebody out with a ladder to carefully move the nest to where it was safe for both patients and the bird family. But we were able to collect that, and we were able to use that data to make a decision, I think, which was pretty neat.
That's a fun example, Steve. I also have one where I was working with a facility in Florida, and they had a question, as many of our customers do, about night noise and specific noise in general. And some night noise was continuing to come up. And what they were noticing is these night noises were actually correlated with issues about a specific type of bed that was being used. Now, 1-2 beds here, 1-2 beds there. Again, it's similar to our AEL example that you gave earlier about the payroll, Steve, in that individually, these don't seem like much. But when we take a look at them with that step back, we can really identify a problem on a larger scale. And then they were actually able to correlate this specific bed to these complaints about noise.
It's a type of bed.
It's a type of bed, yeah. One particular brand of bed. They were all purchased at the same time, and they all required an additional piece. So they were able to batch order all of these pieces, wow, and then install them all in one foul swoop.
Problem solved.
No longer a problem anymore.
That's great.
Yeah, there's lots of exciting examples, and I think really taking the information, it's scientific method. Yeah. You're going to make your hypothesis. We've got to start to collect our baseline, implement a change, evaluate it, and here's good news. If we didn't make an impact, at least we know that solution didn't work. Without data, we might make a change and assume that it fixed it.
Well, and I think about the people listening right now, and they said that they were having trouble getting their teams engaged, and how much more engaged would I be in a process that actually fixed a problem like that for me? Yeah. So you're able to take care of something that was obviously a problem for me and fix it. That should hopefully lead to some of that engagement as well.
Yeah.
All right. So big finale. This is our kind of last topic, and that is we've built this amazing process now. We've identified our why. We've got a leader that's bought in. We've set a date for when we're going to start. We've collaborated on all of these questions. We've built some issues and a process on how to resolve the issues. We've trained our staff. They're all getting rewarded. And now we've got a whole ton of data.
Yeah.
So all good things. Michael, why is it important that we have this great process, that we iterate and that we improve?
Things are continuously changing, Steve. This is not a set it and forget it sort of environment. What we're going to see over time is that our practices of rounding are going to be finding and fixing problems. Other problems are going to be coming up. What we see a lot of the time is we see some fundamental questions that we want to have that are core to what we're doing.
Right.
And perhaps we mark those as, we're going to always keep these because these are foundational to every patient that comes through or every staff member that I talk to. But we're going to have some other questions that we want to be able to have some flexibility with. And as we find new issues, we want to pop them up. Additionally, we want to be able to customize for very specific needs. I mean, when we get advanced in our rounding techniques, a med-surg unit and an ICU have very different needs overall and very different audiences. There's different interactions with families as it relates to patients. And we can start to really, as we get expertise in rounding and using a tool, we can really start to customize a lot. Now, one thing that we always suggest and something that we really try and help our customers with is starting out on a very broad basis, Steve, starting out with some open-ended, very qualitative, descriptive questions. And at first, we get some pushback. I don't have time to put all this in. What we're trying to do through that process is, like you said, identify the key themes so we can figure out that bird dive bombing the front entrance is actually an issue.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes we think things are important to us that maybe aren't necessarily important to our patients. We just don't know because we haven't asked yet.
Exactly. That's it. So, starting out maintaining an open-ended nature, but perhaps identifying the most common areas, and then migrating to more of a multiple choice or multiple select environment where we can still ask an open-ended question, but really identify it into some key buckets. Still having that other category, so we're not missing things, will really allow us to still maintain great conversations, engaging, and do less time with data entry, but at the same time get more out of reporting as well. So that's kind of an evolution around this.
And I've also run into some organizations, and it was just reinforced for me this week that will take a look at, say, something like HCAHPS and look at their bottom performing habits. Yeah. And they'll try to round around just the bottom performer. And I think, all the research when it comes to management, when it comes to coaching and teams, is you try to take, let's get some fast momentum. Let's work on something that maybe is at threshold or just below threshold. Let's move that bar first before we go try to tackle the real kind of, basement issues that we're working on.
You're right, Steve. And with regards to HCAHPS as well, thinking about data-driven decisions, we also know that certain domains are more likely to drive outcomes with patient experience.
Yeah, things like nurse communication, physician communication, maybe more so than cleanliness and things like that.
Exactly. So the desire is to go for this with biggest opportunity, but there needs to be an approach. And I think bringing the team back in there, bringing the administration back in, that kind of group originally that we collaborated with on a regular basis to evaluate our templates, to evaluate our issues and our issue types is really important. I mean, ideally, this is happening, every month. In practice, if we can see a quarterly evaluation, I think that's still a really, really good level of engagement and improvement cycle.
Right. Okay. Well, thanks so much, Michael. I think lastly, we have a poll question coming up. Just to kind of recap, though, I think that the Webinar Hospital here has a pretty good operation in place. We've done everything I think we need to do. We've identified a start date. We've got our why. We know who our executive sponsor is. We're going to act on the data. We're wondering where you are in your journey right now. Maybe you can tell us on the poll question, are you at the front end of that process where you're just starting off to round? Are you in the middle somewhere? Maybe you've plateaued. Or maybe you're already got this thing hardwired and you're doing such a great job, you just want to see it improve a little bit. So please give us that feedback. Oh my goodness! Oh, there we go. We've got more results coming in. For a minute, there was 100% in process of re-implementing. So that is still the number one. In the process of re-implementing is number one so far. And Michael, man, we talked about that towards the beginning. That can be time consuming, and it's a second start. And I wonder if one of these steps was missed.
Yeah. And I would encourage you all, especially that answered that question, to think back over the journey that we've outlined today to see if there's one key area that was missed. And it might be elements of many of those that we've talked about today.
So it's number one at 75% was in the process of re-implementing, and then number two, and the only other one that even made the board was 25% for we have plateaued. And Michael, you and I were having a conversation just before the call about how do we help? Yeah. How do we help organizations that have plateaued or that are re-implementing? How do we kind of get them kicked off in such a way that we map each one of these components out? And if you're missing one of these elements, we really almost push back on you and say, it looks like you haven't identified an executive sponsor here. It looks like you don't have that buy-in, and I'm really worried that it's not going to work if you don't have that. How can we help you? Or how can we, really push on you hard to try to go find that? Because it's maybe not a good investment unless you've got that.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, I do come back to what we were talking about in training as well. We were talking about the process of rounding and the technology. And these are two things that can really get people out of plateau, assuming, of course, that everything else we've talked about is in place. And it might be furthering your skills in rounding and engaging an audience, or it could be leveraging a technology that has reports to allow you to make data-driven decisions to break through to that next level. So It's interesting discussions to follow, and would look forward to hopefully speaking with some of you at a later point in time.
Yeah, and by the way, the chat window is open on the right-hand side. Our next step is to have Katie help us wrap up. But if you want to go into the chat window, please feel free to ask some questions over there. I'd also be interested to hear some of your feedback. And we just talked about you got to kind of hit all the steps, or you maybe are going to plateau. I would love to hear if anybody's got a story about that. We could read it here from the chat. You could just type it in there and say, you know what? Yeah, I think we did miss this one step, and that's what slowed us down. I think we'd all probably benefit from hearing that story. If you wouldn't mind typing it in, we'll look for it.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Steve. So this does conclude our webinar. We're going to be answering some questions that you all have had here momentarily, but before we do that, I did just want to make sure that you knew that if you have any additional questions that we don't answer today, you're able to email us at info@myrounding.com, and we'll make sure that it gets to Steve or Michael appropriately. Also, if you want a copy of this presentation or the webinar recording, you can get that on slideshare.net/myrounding. That URL is up on your screen right now. The slides should be up there right now, and the recording should be up there by tomorrow. And then also, I want to invite you to join us next month for our webinar, High Reliability in Healthcare. This is going to be with an HRO industry expert, David Marshall, so it should be really great. It's currently scheduled for Wednesday, October 26th at 12 noon Mountain Time. And the URL to register for that is at the bottom of your screen there. So I'm going to turn over to some questions. Our first one that has come in is, what are some facilities doing with the recognition that is received from rounding?
I think the biggest thing is sharing it with the team, and there's a couple of different ways to do that. First of all, you need to make sure that the recognition gets to the intended recipient, and that's hopefully the obvious first step. Once you get to that point, then there are opportunities to share that information with the team at large. I'm reminded of a story that you told me, Steve, a while back about an overachiever that everyone had heard about. Everyone knew Bill was an overachiever.
Yeah, he was on all the calls, and patients loved him. His teammates loved him, and it kind of left Joyce in the background. And the reason we found out about Joyce is because she was getting lots of recognition in the tool, but maybe not day-to-day recognition. So the neat thing about that, of course, is we were able to kind of pick through some of the folks that are maybe in the background who aren't larger than life, but still really deserve recognition. There's nothing worse than doing a great job and kind of getting overlooked because you're in somebody's shadow.
Yeah, so I think what that looked like, and what I would suggest is share that information with the team in weekly huddles. If you have, depending on which organization you're in within your facility, this could be a monthly team meeting. It could be a patient experience council. There are many opportunities to share voice of the patient when it comes to staff recognition, and voice of other staff as well. Chances are, like Steve said, many of us can point out those folks that are really these personable, bubbly folks that are brightening up the day as they go by. But there are so many people that are doing such a wonderful job that we might not know about. And it's a matter of really brightening those stars up if we can as well. And so sharing that openly is great. Of course, the opposite side of that is when we're coaching, we want to do that privately. Yeah. So that's something that I really take and try and do, and realize as well, some people take that in different ways. But in general, I think sharing that is really important.
Well, and another best practice in our sister company, the Studer Group, always likes to coach on writing handwritten thank you notes.
Yes.
And I think you can recognize people on the huddles, but maybe at the end of the month, you've got a few high performers that just really deserve something a little bit more personal, and you can write that thank you note. I think it really helps. I always enjoy getting them.
Absolutely.
I, of course, maybe only gotten one over the last couple of years.
No. Right, Steve, thank you.
So, Katie, is there another question?
There sure is. So we've heard you talk a little bit about different applications and tools for rounding, but how do I justify the cost of a rounding application or technology to senior leadership?
Oh, yeah. So a big question, one that we get a lot, and we do our best to try to help with. The topic today is your return on rounding. We could do kind of a number of things. One of them comes down to, even with the recognitions, what is your goal? So are we trying to improve that engagement, improve morale? That's one great way to do it. And a lot of times others, it's just outcomes. We have some great proof that we're able to improve HCAHPS scores when you're rounding with staff and staff are engaged. They tend to give better care. And when you're out there rounding with patients and you're capturing things in real time, as long as you're doing it, in a standardized way and trying to hit every patient every day, you can have a real impact on what the outcomes look like. Mm-hmm. So we definitely have case studies that'll show it's kind of worth it. We could also do some business cases for you to show you that it a lot of times is pennies per patient for great outcomes.
Great. And then we did have one question about if you've seen customers improve their HCAHPS through rounding. So I know you just touched on that a little bit, but could you expand upon that?
Yeah, we have. And we have specifically, there's one organization who I think has done an amazing job. They mapped out the entire patient journey. They reach out before the patient comes in for care, if it's planned care for something like surgery. They round and they use the rounding tool to do that initial outreach and gather some information. They then round if a person comes to the emergency department, they're rounding there. And that's, by the way, I think kind of an overlooked area. A lot of times for upwards of 60% of patients come from the emergency department into the inpatient. And if they have a service that needs to be recovered, if they have a problem while they're in the ED and they land on the inpatient, you basically just handed that problem off to inpatient to fix. And a lot of times we're just measuring in the inpatient, so it's great to be able to measure in the emergency department and take care of those things before they become bigger problems. And then they also do a round, of course, post-discharge to make sure that you're able to care for yourself at home. And they're trying to hit every patient every day. So it's a tall order, I understand, but when you do that standardized process and you've got everybody bought in, they are seeing really great upward trends in all of across most of the domains in HCAHPS, in a couple areas as much as 25 to 30% increase because of this process.
And I think, another part of that is dedicating yourself to do something with the data, because if you're just collecting it, like I said earlier, that might be interesting, but you need to really have a plan in place, and something that we help with is actually setting that plan in place to do something with the data so that we are actually making changes and not just going through the same motions.
Excellent point. All right, and then you did touch on this just a little bit earlier as well, but the last question that I currently have, make sure that keep asking them if you have more questions, is, introducing technology seems really impersonal into especially the bedside with the patient. So how do you overcome that?
Well, I mean, hopefully this session we've conducted today has not been impersonal. I feel like through our interaction, we've gained some insights about what you're looking for and who you are, and hopefully you've gotten a little bit of insight into us as well. Here's an example, again, of technology. I think specifically with the use of technology in direct patient care, you're seeing it all the time, and we're seeing it in an increasing fashion. I think the key is not a surprise, but it's practice and familiarity. And really getting that practice and familiarity is what changes and makes the improvement. When I started sending text messages, I stunk at it, and it was difficult. It was a terrible way to communicate. That technology has changed, and my capability to adapt to it has changed as well. It's taken practice, if you could call it that, but I think over time it really does. I mean, practice makes better, if not perfect.
Yeah, I use Facebook, and my kids use Instagram, and I find out that I really can't track what they're doing unless I'm on Instagram, so I guess I'm learning that now, and I resisted for a very long time, but I need to interact with my kids. So I have to use it.
Try some open-ended questions, Steve.
All right, I will.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for attending. We currently do not have any more questions in the queue, so make sure that if you think of more, go ahead and reach out to us at info@myrounding.com. And make sure that you're also looking for that ebook, as well as getting these slides and webinar copy here later. And with that, we are done. So we hope to see you back here next month, or I guess later this month, for high reliability. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot. Take care.